I've already said good morning to a few folks, so this is our official good evening. Good afternoon to y'all. Thank y'all for coming out today as we talk about what the future of the United Methodist Church and what our potential future here at Troy United Methodist Church may look like. I'm going to go ahead and get us started off and kind of give us a little bit of an overview of where we're going to be going tonight. I'm going to try and be a really good steward of our time tonight because I have a lot of information to give y'all. I know that's a great way to start a presentation, saying I got a lot of information for y'all, but I do have a lot of information for all to give out today. Can all of y'all see me pretty well from here? Do I need to like sit on the riser? Am I good? Okay, awesome. But I have quite a bit of information to give out. I have something like 20-something slides, but my goal is to give you all the information that I have within about 30 to 45 minutes at the most, and then give about 30 minutes of time for questions, if we have questions, totaling about 30 minutes. That way, I don't want us to just be here all night long because that wears on everybody. So that's kind of my hope for the time tonight. If you will, go to the next slide, Shoshana. And so what we're going to talk about today, oh my gosh, I can't read that back slide. So I'm going to be turning around a bit. So what we're going to be talking about today is the current state of the United Methodist Church, where we are right now, how we've gotten to where we're at, where we're going to be going from here. Oh, that helps a lot. Thank you, Galen. And where we're going to be going from here. And one thing that I really want to focus in on today, and I'm going to highlight this, is that today is really about information. To get everybody on the same page, I know that y'all are reading a whole bunch of stuff in the news. You're going to be seeing stuff on Facebook. You're going to be hearing stuff on the radio. You're going to be seeing stuff on TV, news related to the United Methodist Church. And so I want everybody that desires to have the information to be as up to date as we possibly can. I don't want to have any pretense that we're hiding anything or not sharing as much information as we can. So this is what today is about, is getting information to you to share about where we are as a denomination and where we are here at Troy United Methodist and what the future will look like. There is going to be a time for us to really dig into these issues and really talk about what these issues are and the direction we want our church to go in, but today is not the day for that, okay? Today is the day for information. So it's not the day that we're going to decide as a church on one course of action or another, or debate the various sides of the issues that we're going to discuss. So I really want to highlight that, and there will most likely be a time for that, but today's more about just getting information. So we'll have a time for questions and answers, and if there's a question you have related to all of this, I will be very happy to answer whatever question you have that I can. If I don't know the answer, I will get you the answer, or do my best to get you the answer if there is an answer. There are some things that there might not be answers to quite yet, if I'm going to be completely honest with y'all. So, but if there is an answer, I will get you an answer. But if we do get to a part where we're drifting away from information and really starting to trail down like rabbit trailing about debating issues and stuff like that, I'm going to call us back to more pure information today. Because like I said, we'll have a time for deciding the course of our church, but that's not today. That's going to be in the future, and we're going to be talking about when that might be later on in the presentation. All right, so next slide, please. So we have to define a few things as we begin, because I'm going to be by necessity using a few terms in our discussion today that we need to be familiar with. You're going to be hearing terms that are coming up in news articles and things like that. that you'll need to be familiar with. So to begin, as one thing that y'all know about the UMC is that we love our acronyms, right? So if you hear UMC, of course, that's United Methodist Church. One acronym that you'll be hearing more of in the future is GMC, or the Global Methodist Church. The Global Methodist Church, and we're going to talk about what the Global Methodist Church is now and is becoming and will be becoming in the future. But the Global Methodist Church is a new denomination that was founded and began on May 1st of this year with a traditional Wesleyan understanding to be a home for traditional Wesleyan churches. So that's what the Global Methodist Church is. When we talk about the splitting or the schism of the United Methodist Church, really in the future what it's going to look like is we'll have the remnants of the United Methodist Church and many congregations that have split from the United Methodist Church that have joined the Global Methodist Church and a few other denominations, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as well. The WCA, the Wesley Covenant Association, is a name that you might have heard over the last few years. They were begun in 2016 as a conservative callback to traditional conservative callback to more Wesleyan roots. The Wesley Covenant Association is the group that really gave birth to the Global Methodist Church. They began as a movement within the United Methodist Church and have really given birth, their leadership has given birth to what is becoming the Global Methodist Church. I'm going to be using terminology to describe where kind of the divisions are in where we're at. I'm going to try to say progressive and traditional because those seem to be the preferred terms that each side is adopting. I might say orthodox, and orthodox really brings back more of that traditional outlook of faith and things like that. But I'm going to be trying to say progressive, traditional as much as I can to refer to kind of the splits that we're seeing in the Methodist Church. Book of Discipline is this lovely book right here. These are the governing documents of the United Methodist Church. Everything that we do and everything that we are as a denomination is spelled out in this book. Whatever legal authority and everything like that, from the structure of churches to how we ordain people to how we do ministry in many ways, is found in this book. It is updated, edited, and revised every 4 years by General Conference. And our General Conference, and we'll talk more about General Conference in just a moment, is the only body in the United Methodist Church that is authorized to declare what we are, who we are as the United Methodist Church in the Book of Discipline. And then we have a phrase called the trust clause that is going to be mentioned and brought up in a number of ways. In every deed of the United Methodist Church, and every property deed is what is called a trust clause, which basically states that this property is held in trust by Troy United Methodist Church for the Central Texas Conference of the United Methodist Church, which basically states that we as this congregation do not really own the property, but it is held in trust for the denomination. And that trust clause is a way to ensure that churches are abiding by this book of discipline, doing what they're supposed to do, because we hold our property in trust for the denomination. And so that doesn't mean that any church can just break off when the prevailing winds blow in that direction and go do their own thing. This schism and this split of the denomination that we're seeing is a generational event. I want to highlight that. The Methodist Church has split before in the past, notably in the mid-1800s when the Methodist Episcopal Church and the Methodist Episcopal Church South split over the issue of slavery in the United States. That was the last major schism that the Methodist Church in the United States had. And that schism was brought back together in 1939 with the formation of the Methodist Church. and so this is a generational event in many ways, because we have the trust clause, which keeps congregations from just breaking off and doing their own thing. So the trust clause is a big thing, and we'll talk about more how that comes to play with disaffiliating from the denomination later on in the presentation. Next, please. All right. Organization and structure of the United Methodist Church. The United Methodist Church is based on a representative government. So, and you'll notice there are many parallels to how the United Methodist Church is structured to the way that the United States itself is structured. It starts at a very small local level. So if you're looking at our civil government, it starts at the local level, right? You have your city government. Then you get a little bit bigger and you have your county government. You get a little bit bigger and you have congressional districts. Then you have things like state government, and then you have the national government. In many ways, the United Methodist Church is structured like that. It is organized and governed, again, by this wonderful document right here, the Book of Discipline. And we are divided into what are called conferences. And there are conferences from the church level, which is called a church conference, or alternatively a charge conference, but there's a subtle difference in there because not all churches exist independently, but there's a pastor that will serve multiple churches sometimes. That's in Troy's history, right? And so a pastor at this church at one point in time served multiple churches, and those churches together under one pastor's leadership are called a charge. But you have a church conference, which is the voting members, the members of an individual church that are eligible to vote on church matters. Then above that, you have what's called a district conference, which are a smaller group of churches, a more local group of churches together. We are in the South District of the Central Texas Conference. That includes churches in Georgetown, it includes churches in Bell County, it includes churches in Coryell County, and these churches are in a smaller administrative unit that is overseen by a district superintendent who is my direct boss, and they are tasked with knowing the individual churches and the individual pastors in their district on a more relational level. Above that, you have the annual conference. The annual conference is our more regional area that individual churches are members of and overseen by a bishop. The annual conference is the main administrative unit of the United Methodist Church. We are in the Central Texas Annual Conference, which includes churches from the mid-cities in Tarrant County down through Ellis County and all the way down to Round Rock, kind of down this line that separates like Interstate 45 and Interstate 35. We go west all the way towards Ballinger, but we don't include Abilene, and we go north up to Young County, which is the furthest north that you can get in the little town of Alney, Texas, is the furthest north you can get, and everything kind of in between. So think about like Waco and Eastland and Cisco and Fort Worth and Weatherford and Mineral Wells and cities like this. This is all in Breckenridge. This is kind of the boundaries of our conference and overseen by our bishop. And when we talk about disaffiliating later on, it will be the annual conference that governs how a lot of that disaffiliation happens, because this is the main administrative unit of the United Methodist Church. Above the annual conference, we have a jurisdictional conference. And if you'll go to the next slide, please. This shows the conference layouts. You see us right here in the Central Texas Conference, right in the heart of the state. And our conference, incidentally, is shaped like the state of Texas. So that is our annual conference. Our jurisdictional conference is New Mexico, Texas, Oklahoma, Nebraska, Kansas, Missouri, Arkansas, and Louisiana. We are the South Central jurisdiction. And what the jurisdiction is really in charge of is electing bishops and setting annual conference boundaries. That's basically all the jurisdictional conference does. And above the jurisdictional conferences are all the United Methodist churches in the world are all the annual conferences in the world, including the central conferences in foreign nations, send delegates to General Conference. And General Conference is where all the church law is decided. An equal number of delegates, lay, which is you folks in the pews, and clergy are elected to go and represent our annual conference in jurisdictional and general conference. So there's an equal number of lay delegates and clergy delegates that are represented. Like I said, this is a representative government. Every 4 years, our annual conference elects new delegates to represent us to go to jurisdictional and general conference. The clergy elect clergy, and the lay people elect lay people. So I'm not responsible for electing any lay people. Lay people are elected by fellow lay people, and clergy are elected by fellow clergy. Again, representative government. And the general conference is that's where the buck stops in the United Methodist Church. That's where they are the only organization that can officially speak on behalf of the entire denomination. It's where church law is made, everything like that. So when I say general conference, that's what I mean. General conference is not a super local thing. General conference is a worldwide thing, and normally general conference only meets every 4 years. Let's go to the next slide, please. So our local church structure is, again, representative government. We are prescribed by the discipline to have certain committees. A pastor appointed by the bishop, who oversees the annual conference, a church council that kind of keeps a holistic view on the things that are going on in the church, trustees that manage the building and assets of the church, finance committee, and a staff pastor parish relations committee that's kind of our intermediary between me and the bishop and the folks like that. They tell me what I'm doing good, what I'm doing bad, and if y'all want me to leave, they say, hey, David needs to leave, or if you want me to stay, they say, David needs to stay. You know, they do those type of things, staffing issues and the like that. And those are all prescribed by the discipline. And again, it's a representative government, so all these people that serve on these committees are from the church, elected by the church. All right, next, please. I told y'all this is going to be like drinking from a fire hose, but it's all information I think that we need to share to be all on the same page. So how we got to where we are. I spoke earlier about the Methodist Church being formed in 1939 when the Methodist Episcopal Church South and the Methodist Episcopal Church merged back together after their division over slavery. In 1968 was the Uniting Conference, with many of the fractured Methodist denominations merging together, or the former Wesleyan denominations merging together, specifically the Methodist Church and the Evangelical United Brethren. And they merged in 1968 to form the United Methodist Church. We are called United because it's pulling that Evangelical United Brethren name and placing it in front of the Methodist Church. That's why we're the United Methodist Church. In 1968, when that happened, the issue that really is the presenting issue, the main issue of the day, the ordination of homosexual people and marrying homosexual people within our congregations, was not even a topic in the Book of Discipline. That's because, in many ways, it wasn't something that was really on the radar socially at the time. In about 1970, there was a pastor in one of the Texas conferences who was doing ministry with homosexual people, and he came out as being gay himself. And he had his credentials as a pastor stripped from him. And it was a big deal because they said that you're not fit to be a pastor, and he said, why? And they said, it's because you're gay, and he said, show me where it's against church law. And it wasn't against any church law, and so it was a big deal. This was, mind you, like 1970, 1971. In 1972, we had our first general conference after the Uniting Conference, and that is where our long-held statement about homosexual people came into being, because there was a lot of debate about this on general conference floor. We couldn't agree about this issue in 1972, and we've been fighting over it, and it's getting more and more and more and more intense every subsequent General Conference that meets every 4 years. So we have a statement that basically says that we acknowledge that homosexual people are persons of sacred worth, but we believe that their life is incompatible with the witness of the Bible. So it's kind of speaking one thing out of one side of your mouth while saying another out of the other side of the mouth is really what the official stance of the United Methodist Church has been since 1972. Since then, each General Conference has contested this statement, trying to get it to be more rigorous or trying to get it to go away ever since 1972. In the early 2000s, pastors in more progressive churches began to intentionally defy the Book of Discipline, which prohibits the marriage of homosexual people and the ordination and serving as pastors of homosexual people in the Book of Discipline. In more progressive areas that had sympathetic bishops, it was allowed. In more traditional areas, pastors were stripped of their credentials and not allowed to be in ministry anymore for marrying people of homosexual people or for coming out as a practicing homosexual person themselves. One important thing to mention is that it's never been against church law to be a homosexual person that is celibate. Never been against church law. So, next slide. So, like I said, we've been fighting about this issue since 1972. In 2016, we had what marked as a watershed year in the United Methodist Church. There was a lot of stuff that happened in 2016. We had our General Conference, and it was very much a deadlock and standstill over this one topic. And the fear was that we would have a General Conference like we did in 2012 that accomplished basically nothing because we are debating one issue and one issue only and not focusing on what the ministry of the church needs to be, which is making disciples of Jesus Christ. And instead, we've been so consumed with the human sexuality issue that we have not been fulfilling our mission. It happened in 2012 at General Conference, and it was happening again in 2016. There was a request from the conference floor that the bishops lead in this issue. Bishops in General Conference really are tasked with being the presiders of the conference. They don't make decisions for the church because the body, the voting delegates, the clergy and lay people are the voting delegates, and so they make the decisions about where the church goes. So the bishops merely, not merely, but their role is really advice and not overt action. So there was a request made that the bishops do this. And so the bishops convened, and they made a few suggestions from their perspective. They said, we need to table all talk of human sexuality at this General Conference and focus on all of our other business. We will appoint a commission of people, a task force of people from across the globe and across the different perspectives on this issue to deal with this matter and come up with a solution for our entire denomination to be presented at a special called session of General Conference that only deals with this issue in 2019. And that motion was universally passed. And there was hope for the future. So the formation of the Global Task Force took place. Our conference actually had a delegate on that Global Task Force, was a pastor of, at First deacon in First Fort Worth at the time. But what also happened in 2016 are two notable things to mention. The Western jurisdiction, which includes California, Oregon, and Washington, and Nevada, elected the first openly homosexual bishop, who she was in a relationship, long-standing relationship, and serving as a pastor at a church in San Francisco before she was elected as a bishop. She is currently a bishop in the Colorado and Rockies area annual conference. But the Wesley Covenant Association was also formed to be a conservative witness against these perceived, transgressions against the Book of Discipline. And so there's been tension, and it was moved that during this time that all ongoing clergy trials related to issues of sexual sexual orientation and things like that be suspended until the future was resolved. So we put it all on the back burner in 2016. Next, please. So the Global Task Force met and developed 3 different plans to proceed as a way forward to present at the 2019 General Conference. So the 2019 General Conference meets with great expectation and high expectations that we're finally going to receive a resolution for this issue. At the end, the traditionalist voting bloc maintained the status quo and even further tighten the restrictions about performing homosexual marriages and having homosexual people being pastors. And rather than feeling themselves the winners, it seemed like every delegate to that special session of General Conference felt defeated. Because it was at that General Conference that it really became apparent that we might not be able to hold together as a church with the divisions that we have been experiencing. The vote to uphold the status quo was by a very, very, very thin margin. I think there was 40-something votes that they won by. But in the end, nobody really felt like they were winners. Delegates from our delegation came back and said the same thing from both the conservative and the progressive perspective. And so it was really felt that we were heading towards a split after 2019. Next slide, please. After the special called session of General Conference, a man named Kenneth Feinberg was a professional mediator, was at synagogue, and he felt God speak to him saying, you need to help the Methodists find a better way. And so he sought us out and brought together a coalition of all the differing theological perspectives and all the kind of the movers and shakers behind the scenes. You know the people, right? You know, the people that are leading the charge and all the special interest groups. And they met for quite a while, and they came up with something called the Protocol of Grace Through Separation, which was universally accepted from all sides of the issue and was planned to be presented at our scheduled General Conference of 2020. And then, COVID. And then, 2020 General Conference was rescheduled for 2021. 2021 General Conference was rescheduled for 2022. 2022 General Conference was canceled. And they said, we're just going to meet in 2024 as we would have otherwise. So it's been now over 2 years since the protocol was developed, and a lot has changed in the world since then. And when the announcement was made to cancel the 2022 General Conference, where the protocol would have been uplifted, and the protocol basically said that as long as you go to a Wesleyan denomination that has more than like 50 members, everybody's free to make their choice and go where they want to go to. No strings attached, just go. Because we can do this separation in a godly way. When that news was announced, next slide, please, the Global Methodist Church was announced because the traditionalists felt like enough had been enough, that there had been already tons of examples of rule breaking and not following the Book of Discipline, and it was just time to make a split and start something new. So they announced the beginning of the Global Methodist Church in March or April of 2022, of this year. It was formally established May 1st of 2022. And that's what brings us really here today, because there has been a lot of stuff happening since the Global Methodist Church went live. That it's very difficult to just talk about in a written form. That it's better to present the information and provide any answers that I can in a question and answer session instead. So next slide, please. So what's currently happening? The Global Methodist Church has published their transitional doctrines and discipline and is beginning to accept churches. So far, churches from Romania and Eastern Europe have joined the Global Methodist Church. They're onboarding churches, Methodist churches from South America. They are in the process and expect by the end of summer, many of the African conferences will be joining the Global Methodist Church. And by the end of this year, they will be receiving their first congregations from the first big wave of congregations from the United States. There are congregations that have already separated from the United Methodist Church in the past few years that are already working on joining the Global Methodist Church. Our annual conference has developed a process for disaffiliation and will hold a special called session of our annual conference this September to formally allow the first group of churches to disaffiliate. Currently, as it stands, there was a deadline to apply for disaffiliation on June the 1st. There are 92 churches out of our 264 churches in our annual conference that have petitioned to explore disaffiliation. Now, not all of those churches will disaffiliate, but many of those churches will probably disaffiliate. Support for the protocol since that time, remember the protocol we talked about, that compromise that was hammered out, has waned since that time and has been formally rescinded by a few different groups. Many of the progressive groups, I feel, have rescinded the protocol because they felt hurt by the Global Methodist Church being founded, that it was kind of a break of trust. And so, okay, then if we're doing this, then, let them do what they're going to do. So that's kind of where we are currently at. Next slide, please. That's where we're currently at. So why is the big question? Why is all of this happening? The United Methodist Church has had long been a denomination that's been big tent in theology. Ever since we combined the Methodist Episcopal Church and the Methodist Episcopal Church South, we've had a very broad view of our theology, where we have invited very small churches, very large churches, very urban churches, very rural churches, very conservative churches, and very liberal churches and progressive churches all together to worship God, because for the longest time, despite whatever differences that we may have had, we can say Jesus is Lord and that we are about doing Jesus's work, and that is good enough to keep us together. And we've been able to stay together and kind of learn and grow from each other from all of our different and various perspectives over the years. But over those years, we have also been fracturing along these theological divides. And the LGBTQ inclusion has been a presenting issue. It's not the only issue that is plaguing the United Methodist Church, but it's been the big hot button issue. Some people will say that it's just a visible issue for a whole slew of other issues. And one of my arguments, that's true to an extent, but I don't believe if it were for the LGBTQ issues, if this was already been resolved, the United Methodist Church would probably not be splitting right now. And we'd probably be in a much better place. So I think it's a little bit disingenuous to call it merely a presenting issue. It's one of a number of issues, but it's a very large issue that has led us to this point as well. Next slide, please. Other factors in play. Christology, that's the theological term for how we see Jesus Christ. How divine was Jesus? How much do we uphold Jesus and his work? The traditional churches will have a very high Christology. There are some churches that don't have as high of a theology, and there are definitely some pastors that don't have a very high Christology. That you may see a pastor occasionally that will say, Jesus was a great teacher, but I don't know how divine he was. That's one of the issues that is undergirding what this theological and fracturing is happening in the United Methodist Church. There are issues of biblical interpretation. How do we interpret the Bible? Is the Bible the inerrant word of God, that what you read on that page must be taken at face value, or is the Bible has been inspired by God, but there is a little bit of human fingerprints in the Bible, as well as people have pushed their own agendas at times. How do we interpret the Bible? That's one of the big pressing issues, and that's one of the issues that has led to our debate over homosexuality, because both sides can make a biblical case for where they are at. Willingness or not willingness to follow the book of discipline is another very, very big issue that has been plaguing the United Methodist Church. The autonomy of the local church is another large issue, especially for very large churches. Our largest churches like to do things their way, and they do not like being told by the conference what to do, especially when it means that they have to get a new pastor. And the weight of our institutional structure has been an issue, that sometimes we are too burdened by the bureaucracy to really do the mission and ministry that we need to do. How much bureaucracy do you have? How much conference structure? How much general church structure do you have? Or do you have a very light one? That's been a debate throughout all this time. These are all issues that are causing the fracturing of the United Methodist Church. Next slide, please. So, here's a little bit about the Global Methodist Church. And in full disclosure, I took a lot of these points from a presentation from a Global Methodist Church person that was presenting about what the Global Methodist Church is. I figured their points would very adequately describe where they're at. And so these aren't all my words here, so I don't want to, I want to give credit where credit is due. So the Global Methodist Church, this is, again, the traditional branch that is forming of the Methodist Church, that is splitting away from the United Methodist Church. They want to be consistent in orthodox, which is another word for traditional theology, with a very heavy emphasis on the authority of the Bible, more literal interpretation and reading of the Bible. They want to focus on accountable discipleship, that one of the things we've lost over the years in the United Methodist Church is really an intense focus on discipleship. That's one of the things that we're going to be working on over the coming months, actually, is have a more intense focus on discipleship. They want to focus on church planning and multiplication, especially not saying, okay, we're going to appoint this pastor and give them $50,000 a year for 5 years and expect they have a church planted by that time, which is what our church planning model has been. But to start with families that are related to an individual church, have start home churches and give the resources to start a home church with the idea that those will grow into new faith communities. They want to focus on the mission of the church, and I think this is something that we all agree on. When we get past this divide, whatever future awaits us, United Methodist Church, Global Methodist Church, we will be able to focus on what our mission is, and that is serving Jesus Christ. And that's a day that I really, while I have long dreaded and really have prayed that we don't have to walk through this valley together, that day when we get past this and we can set aside our differences and focus on serving Jesus is going to be a really good day. They want to focus on a lean bureaucracy. Less conference staff, less general church staff, so they will cap the amount of apportionments that churches give. Apportionments are like a church tax that every United Methodist Church pays to the denomination. Some go to the conference level, some go to the global level. They will cap that at 6.5% of a church's budget, 5% to the annual conference, 1.5% to the general church. The intent is that you spend the other 3.5%, that you as a church give a tithe of your budget, and 10% is your tithe, that you spend the other 3.5% on local missions at home. Currently, we actually pay, in the United Methodist Church, 5.7% of our budget to apportionments. So we're actually under that threshold that they're setting right now. In full disclosure, our apportionments have gone down over the last few years as our conference has really cut a lot of things as a result of the pandemic and anticipation of the church split, but that's where we're at right now. So I didn't want to say that's what it will be with not including where we're at right now. And then a big one is that in the Global Methodist Church, there will be no church trust clause, that every local congregation holds its own property. Next slide. Continuing on, the Global Methodist Church wants to have a redefined role of bishops with term limits for bishops, where a bishop can serve for 12 years and then they have to go back to a local church. Systematic accountability. Sometimes when you need to bring a pastor up on charges for not doing what they're supposed to be doing, it can take a long time because we have a lot of checks and balances built into that. They want to streamline that quite a bit more than what it has. More congregational input on clergy selection. This is going to be one of the big rubber meets the road things for every congregation that goes to the Global Methodist Church, because it will be a more congregational model like our Baptist brothers and sisters rather than the Episcopal model, which we have had for a long time, where churches will get to interview pastors. Right now, the idea is that, and again, this is from their transitional discipline, and so, terms are subject to change, okay? Right now, the idea is that pastors will be able to, a church will keep their pastor until one of two things happens. The church says, we want this pastor to move, and the pastor says they want to move. Other than that, they say they're not going to be calling for a pastor to move. When that happens, the district superintendents will put together 3 different candidates for the church to interview. And a pastor that is moving will have, or wanting a new appointment, will have 3 different churches to interview at. And then they get to rank what they want, and hopefully kind of patterns emerge is what they're hoping. Now, when I read the transitional document, that's from one of their presentations. When the first draft of the transitional discipline that I read had a little bit more of a role for the local church in there, so take some of that maybe with a grain of salt. But that's kind of what I've heard about what the pastoral appointment process will look like. A much greater role in clergy and churches being able to choose where they go. They want to offer an easier path to ordination because being ordained in the United Methodist Church, I know for a lot of folks this doesn't make a hill of beans, but it takes a long time. And then to, again, uphold traditional understanding of marriage between one man and one woman and prohibit practicing LGBTQ peoples from serving in ministry. So that's in a nutshell what the Global Methodist Church is. So these are the choices that are available to every local United Methodist congregation. You can remain in the United Methodist Church. You can wait for General Conference 2024 before making a decision. You can seek disaffiliation, which happens to fall on, there are 3 ways to disaffiliate from the United Methodist Church found in the Book of Discipline. And we're going to talk about all 3 of these, so I'm going to skip over those for a little bit. You can seek disaffiliation, or you can seek a legal separation through remedy in the U.S. court system. Yeah, I hear a few groans because that's not a really great option. Because even if you win, the only people that will win will be the lawyers. Not to hate on our lawyer brothers and sisters, but it is going to be an expensive option if that's the direction that churches choose to take. So next slide, please. So here's how the 3 disaffiliations happen in the United Methodist Church as prescribed by our Book of Discipline. Remember, if we would have had General Conference in 2020, there would have been a reconciliation and separation through grace, which would have really allowed everybody to just go where they wanted to go. It's more complicated than that now because we didn't. The launch of the Global Methodist Church happened before the resolution of reconciliation through grace was able to be presented. So there is a gracious exit provision in the Book of Discipline, and it was added at the called General Conference in 2019. and it allows churches to disaffiliate from the United Methodist Church over issues of conscience related to issues of human sexuality. So all a church needs to say is, we want to disaffiliate because we don't think that the United Methodist Church is doing what it needs to be doing related to this issue. We will find a better home in this denomination. But what will be required is a 2/3 majority vote from church conference. This is why I brought up church conferences before. Every member of the church gets a vote at a church conference. Now, most churches that I've served have a lot of people that are very dedicated people that come to church and worship here that are not members. They're called, we call them on the constituency roll is the official term for that are dedicated people that attend worship and are involved in the life of the church but do not hold church membership here. So if we, for example, hypothetically, if we chose to disaffiliate and have this vote, you would need to be a member on our membership rolls to vote in this church conference, which means that we will need to audit our rolls to make sure they're up to date, and you would need to check ahead of time with Betty to make sure that your name is on our rolls. And we would have a cutoff date for accepting new members because we're not going to let people become members at the meeting. Right? So there's a lot of legwork that's going to be needing to take place before this happens. But a 2/3 majority would need to vote to disaffiliate. If there is not a 2/3 majority, for example, if we have 100 people voting, we need 67 people to vote yes to disaffiliation to allow disaffiliation to happen. If that majority is not met, the church cannot disaffiliate. Terms of disaffiliation are established between the congregation and the annual conference board of trustees. Our annual conference is very lenient towards disaffiliations. I want to put that out right now. They seek to work with churches to provide an easy path forward. And so right now what this stands at is that a church would pay 2 years worth of apportionments, church taxes. Our apportionments are roughly $18,000 a year. So we would need to pay $36,000 if we were to pursue disaffiliation, plus any unfunded pension liabilities that exist, which vary from church to church. And then have a simple majority vote of approval at an annual conference. This gracious exit provision of the Book of Discipline expires December 31st, 2023. Note that this is before the next session of General Conference. That's a big point, okay? Next, you can depart by a very vaguely worded paragraph in the Book of Discipline, which is paragraph 2548.2. If you wish to read, you can read it up here after the meeting. It is a very vaguely worded paragraph. But it is not applicable to churches seeking to leave leave for the Global Methodist Church, because the denomination leaving, the leaving denomination that must be going to a denomination that's in the Pan-Methodist Commission or another evangelical denomination that the United Methodist Church has a comity agreement with. And since the Global Methodist Church was just founded, we have no such agreement with them. There are people working behind the scenes to make that agreement a reality, but none has been reached as of yet. So therefore, churches that are leaving for the Global Methodist Church cannot leave via this paragraph. It is potentially, underline potentially, less burdensome financially. Because you could say, hey, you're leaving, and there are some churches that will leave for, say, the Free Methodist Church under this paragraph because they are in the Pan-Methodist Commission. And potentially, you could exit without the apportionment fees and only have to pay your back pension liabilities. Potentially. The big stickler is that as for judicial council, we talked about the United Methodist Church being like the United States in terms of how we're run. We have a judicial council, which is the Supreme Court of the United Methodist Church, and I believe there was a judicial council ruling or something similar that said you have to have a trust clause in the receiving denomination to go to the receiving denomination. The Global Methodist Church does not have a trust clause, so that is a sticking point for this paragraph. Next slide, please. You can also disaffiliate by going independent, which is really not an option, because going independent would mean that the annual conference would close your individual church and retain all the property and every cent that is in your bank accounts. And from outside funds, you buy your church back. Like I said, that's not an option. Now, there have been some annual conferences that have worked with their churches that wanted to go independent and came up with much better terms than this. But if an annual conference wants to be a stickler, that's what the Book of Discipline says. Annual conferences can be much more lenient, but we do not have a precedent in our annual conference for going independent. So it's not really a good option for disaffiliation. Next, where we're at Troy United Methodist Church. I promise I'm getting close to the end of my slides, okay, y'all? But a lot of information that has to be said, okay? Our church council met on April 20th and discussed where we fell on this issue of disaffiliation. At that time, the conference hadn't even established what the disaffiliation costs would be. Remember, I shared them with you just a little bit ago, 2 years worth of apportionments and any back pension liabilities that the church may hold. The conference hadn't established any of that yet. And in fact, the Global Methodist Church hadn't even been officially started as of that time. There were a lot of unknowns when we met to discuss this issue, with the deadline for applying for disaffiliation June 1st. We felt at that meeting that there were far too many unknowns for us to make a wise and prudent decision for our church. And so we decided to wait and see what would happen. Next slide. What's most likely to happen next? Remember that, almost knocked that over. Remember when I talked about the gracious exit provision that expires in 2023? That's the elephant in the room relating to what we do as a denomination. Until the Global Methodist Church went live, we were waiting for the next general conference because they would have provided steps outlined for what we could do in the future in a very orderly and outlined way. But we don't have that. We have two big unknowns. And one is what our annual conference will do after this deadline, and what the general conference will do after this deadline. Will there be a version of the protocol of reconciliation through grace that is offered and said, hey, if you stuck with us and you still don't like where we're going, go join another Wesleyan congregation, no strings attached. We understand that you need to be where you're comfortable at. That is a possibility. Could it also be a possibility that there's a lot of heartache and anger and over the formation of the Global Methodist Church, and a punitive exit provision is applied? That is a possibility too. I want to say that I don't think that it will happen, but that's 2 years away. And there's no telling what things are going to be happening, what our world is going to look like, who these delegates are going to be. I can't tell you what's going to happen in 2024. So the question is, do we have a vote to leave early if we feel like we need to vote to disaffiliate? Or do we hold where we're at until 2024 and see what happens with the United Methodist Church and where where the Global Methodist Church is going to. Because remember, their book of discipline is provisional until voted on at their first general conference, which is also in 2024. There are a lot of unknowns until 2024. And so what do we do is the big question. Our church council will have some very serious and prayer-filled discussions related to this topic, because the formation of the Global Methodist Church most likely pushed up our timeline that we talked about at our last meeting. Because if we feel like we need to have a vote for disaffiliation, it most likely needs to happen before the 2023, December 31st, 2023 deadline. Which means if that is the case, we will present options to the congregation about what the Global Methodist Church is, maybe going to Free Methodist Church and staying with the United Methodist Church, and saying, here are the pros, here are the cons, these are what options are available to us. And then have a vote based on where we feel we need to be going. If we do have a vote, it will probably take place. If we want to have a vote before the 2023 deadline, we will probably need to submit paperwork to the annual conference by sometime in January of next year. We will most likely have a period of discernment, more information sessions, time to really talk as a church about what we feel God is calling us to in the future. We need to be able to take the transitional doctrines and disciplines of the Global Methodist Church and read them and say, we feel like this is where we could be, or saying, I don't know about this. So there's still a lot of unknowns right now. But I feel like this is a very real timeline for us, that maybe by next spring we will most likely need to have a vote. Because if I'm going to be honest with y'all, and the reason why there are 90 some odd churches already disaffiliating is because a lot of those churches are almost 100% traditionalist in their churches. They knew they were going to do this before the Global Methodist Church went live. They've been waiting for this. One of my former churches is one of these churches. They've been waiting for this to happen. These are churches that have been talking about disaffiliating before Global Methodist Church went live. That is not our church. When we have our vote, it's going to be closer than 90-10, I believe. And so it's going to be more prudent for us to spend time and really discern where we need to be before we have the vote. Because when we have the vote, that will be the line in the sand, if we're going to be honest about it. So the question is, when? Do we wait until General Conference to see what happens in 2024? Or do we have a vote before then? That's the next big question facing the leadership of our congregation. And that's something that we will talk very intensely about, like I said, with our church council. And if you have opinions about where we need to be going with that, you are free to talk to your church council as well, to say, this is where I feel we need to be going. And we'll probably have some listening sessions so we can discern where the congregation is on all of this. Next slide, please. I know I gave y'all a lot of information, and I really appreciate y'all sticking with me. I had only wanted to talk for 45 minutes, and I talked for almost an hour. But I think every piece of information was very necessary to share, because it gets us where we've been and where we are now. So I want to, if y'all have questions related to what we just talked about, and if I can clarify anything or haven't covered anything, now's the time to please ask questions. If you are watching on Facebook and you have questions, please type them in the comment section, and we'll have those questions raised as well. So what questions do y'all have? Yes. I don't know, the organizations of the Methodist and Global Methodist churches are, remember, it's all representative. And so we really don't have a huge head honcho. There are a few people that have been playing very large roles in the formation of the denomination. And I don't want to lie to you. I know one of our former, actually a former district superintendent of ours, Reverend Dr. Leah Hitty Gregory, is a very large player in the formation of the Global Methodist Church. Keith Boyette, who is a large church pastor, I don't remember exactly where. They are traditionalists, so they are not for LGBTQ inclusion. And I also had a question this week about the Global Methodist Church's stance on abortion, and it is also a traditionalist stance that is prohibitive of abortion. It will be yes. They will, what they are saying right now is that they will welcome them as members. It'll be very much like kind of where we've been, but a bit more overtly prohibitive, saying you can be members, we welcome you as a person in love and God, but we won't marry you and we won't allow you to be a pastor, and be very specific about saying those things. So you can go to church there, and depending on the church, you can serve in committees and things like that. But that's about where it stops. Yes, sir. Yes. The reasoning for paying apportionments 2 years ahead is that the conference has certain obligations that they need to fulfill financially speaking, from staff people and everything like that. And for example, we could potentially have 92 churches leave our conference within the next year, which completely destroys any staffing, any budgets items that you have. We give support not just to staff, but places like Glen Lake Church Camp and other ministries and things like that, which could be very damaging to those existing ministries without a buffer period to be able to absorb the shock of having a significantly less number of churches that are giving your apportionment. So that's the reasoning behind that. It's a pretty standard thing that most churches that are disaffiliating pay a certain number of years worth of apportionments. It is pretty standard across the board. So that's the reasoning behind that.
David,
Yes.
you have an online question.
Oh, okay.
Where will the UMC stand on abortion, not GMC?
That's difficult to say. Right now, we like the LGBT issue. We thread the needle. We try and thread the line on both sides, saying we love everybody, but we really, see, people as created in the image of God, and so, we don't, unless there are very specific circumstances, we don't really condone abortion, but we, offer our support to anybody that needs our support after having received those procedures and stuff like that. That could change in 2024. I can't verify that it will or not, but we will be losing a very large traditional contingent of our denomination by 2024. So that could very well change in some way, shape, or form. But I can't say that it will. I can't say that it won't. But potentially speaking, at General Conference 2024, one of the big first things to be passed will be inclusion of LGBT people, being able to marry them and being able to serve as pastors. I could see that being included. I could see it being debated over and kind of maintain the status quo. I just can't, I don't have a crystal ball to answer fully that question. Nancy. I think, and it depends on the camps. what Glen Lake has done, and this is maybe an indicator of what will happen to some of our things. They will become more shared rather than wholly owned by one conference. Glen Lake is hosting a camp that is run by a lot of the WCA people, that are Wesley Covenant Association people, this summer. And they've opened their doors and said, hey, we have a Methodist camp that's run by more of our traditionalist congregations, and so we're offering that. I could see, for example, Glen Lake might retain its whole affiliation with the Central Texas Annual Conference, which means it will remain United Methodist. There's also the potential for it to spin off kind of maybe as its own 501c3 and maintain connections with like the Central Texas Methodist, United Methodist, and the Central Texas Global Methodist, and offer a holistic type of camping experience, saying here's our United Methodist option, here's our global option, and that's actually happening this summer. But I don't, that's not, that's a educated guess, but not a definitive answer. Same thing with UMCOR, United Methodist Committee on Relief, one of the things that the United Methodist Church does so very well. What's it going to happen? What's happening to it? And I think there's going to be a lot of places. Our General Board of Pensions and Health Benefits renamed themselves WestPath, and I think they're setting themselves up to serve both denominations. The the Texas Methodist Foundation has renamed themselves as well, and has rebranded themselves as well, setting themselves up to, that's incidentally where our building loans are held at. They're setting themselves up to service both sides. And so I think some of these shared resources are going to continue to be shared if at all possible. Other questions? Yes. Until 2024, everything remains as it is. In 2024, again, David's crystal ball, it will be changed relating to LGBT inclusion. No, no. And that's the big question mark. Do you vote for disaffiliation before or after the general conferences? Because the transitional book of discipline for the for the Global Methodist Church could wind up being quite different after their general conference. You don't know until that happens, and that's not going to happen in 2024, until 2024. There's just I wish I had more solid answers, but I feel like all I'm offering is question marks on some of these things, but it's the reality of where we're at. The Global Methodist Church, they will, if one of their people was standing here before you right now, they would say that that is absolutely false. They will uphold a very high view of Jesus Christ being Son of God. Very more mainline traditional views of Jesus. And so that's where they're at. That's one of their big complaints about some United Methodist pastors, is that there are some United Methodist pastors that have a very low Christology, a low belief in Jesus' divinity and things like that. And so one of the things that the Global Methodist Church is going to ensure is that their churches, and especially their pastors, have that high view of Jesus' divinity and literal, more of a literal biblical interpretation. So I think while I'm not involved in the formation of the Global Methodist Church, I can say with pretty much confidence that they will They will. Jesus is Son of God, fully man, fully human. And again, you can find on Global Methodist, I think it's globalmethodist.org, they have a PDF of their transitional doctrines and disciplines, and it will tell you and spell you out for you everything that they believe and what they are founding their church on. So, don't just take my word for it. It's globalmethodist.org. Don't take my word for it. Go to globalmethodist.org and their book of discipline. So our book of discipline is 898 pages. Their transitional doctrine and disciplines is like 164 pages. So it's not an onerous read, especially read like sections 1 and 2, and it really tells you what the denomination is and what they hope to become.
David, you have another online
Yes.
question? Where does the Free Methodist Church stand on LGBTQ?
Same position that the Global Methodist Church has. That you invite homosexual people into relationship with you, into your churches, free to worship and things like that, but not free to be married and not free to be ordained. Yes, Richard. Yes. I don't know that off the top of my head, but it's Mandy's looking it up, and she'll tell us. I Googled it. I spent some time on there today, actually, through Google, but I got there through Google. But they do have a website. Is there a website for the Free Methodists? Yes. Mandy's looking up their website right now. fmcusa.org. So free FMC for Free Methodist Church USA.org to look up what they believe. And again, they'll be more traditional. Incidentally, the Free Methodists were founded in 1860 because they felt like the Methodist Episcopal Church was not doing all they could in their power to fight against slavery in the United States. But they have a very high Christology as well, a very deep understanding of the Bible. That's a good question, Galen. So Galen asks, since there is no trust clause with the Global Methodist Church, what's to stop a church from rejecting what the Global Methodist Church has in their book of discipline and just doing what they want anyway? Because the trust clause kind of holds a lot of the United Methodist churches accountable. I don't know. I really don't. And I think that's, it might be something where you begin with a number of churches in the Global Methodist Church, but then we'll see more fracturing if the theological lines are divided with them later on down the road, because there is no trust clause. So churches will be able to go do whatever they want to do if they affiliate with the Global Methodist Church. So it's going to look more Southern Baptist in the way that it's governed and run, that, every church gets to vote where they're at and kind of hold to it. And then there's a looser connection that holds them together than what has been kind of binding the United Methodist Church together. Other questions? It's frightening. Yes. When the 2024 General Conference happens, it will be skewed more progressive because we will have a number of churches departing before then. Like I said, so far we've had 92 churches petition to explore disaffiliation. How many in our annual conference out of 260 some odd churches? That's a very large number. And so, so when General Conference happens, it's going to have a more progressive skew to it than it will beforehand, just by that nature. So it's frightening. It really is. And Mandy will tell you, she talks me off the ledge frequently. Because when I began to explore my call to ministry, I never anticipated that I would be a pastor presiding over and experiencing the dissolution and breakup of the United Methodist Church. My granny, try not to get emotional, okay, y'all? My granny was a member of the Texas City Methodist Episcopal Church and was a founding member of the Texas City Methodist Church when they merged with the Methodist Episcopal Church South in 1930s, okay? And here I am a pastor, and I'm gonna, have to choose my side when the time comes. Here's what I want to proclaim and how I've been trying to lead this church. I want to give you as much information as you can to be as informed as you can regarding these issues, because I don't want anything to be to appear to be hidden. Because we're going to have to deal with this at some point in time. This ends with our church taking a vote, okay? The question is when it ends with our church taking a vote, okay? But it's frightening. And like I said, Mandy has to talk me down from my ledge a little bit periodically because, this is uncharted territory for a lot of pastors, presiding over the disaffiliation and the dissolution of your denomination. And this is my pledge. I will do my best to not lead this church from a place of fear. Even if I try to go there or want to go there, I will do my best to not lead this church from a place of fear. Because this issue has the potential to sideline everything that we do for Jesus. And it's been happening at our denominational level for far too long. And so my goal as your pastor is to have this church say, we are going to have to tackle this issue. But there are other, and I will say it, more important things that we need to be about between now and when we have the vote. Because we need to grow in our love and knowledge of Jesus Christ here, and we need to spread that love and knowledge of Jesus Christ out there. That is why we exist, to glorify God in everything we are, in everything that we do. And this is a decision that we will have to make and discern about where the Spirit and the Holy Spirit is leading us as a congregation. Make no bones about it. But we cannot allow it to detract us from our mission of living out lives as disciples of Jesus. So I will do my best to keep that from happening. And say, regardless of what will come, we will push forward in what we are doing. Because tomorrow's, Jesus said it, right? Tomorrow has worries enough of its own. But right here today, who are we and what are we doing? What is Jesus calling us to be doing? And I pray that wherever we wind up, that we find ourselves in an excellent position to keep serving Jesus Christ into the future. Because that's the most important thing. And that's my prayer for this whole schism within the United Methodist Church, that when the dust settles, each side finds those fields white for the harvest. and reaches people in ways that we haven't been able to reach people for Jesus while we've been together because we've been fighting over these issues for far too long. And I hope that we can do that as well as a church. And so, while it's frightening, try not to be fearful. Because you know what? Jesus is Lord, y'all. Isn't that good news? That Jesus has the future taken care of, whatever it may be. That we just have to trust him with that future and be faithful to follow where he calls us to follow. And the Spirit will take care of us. That's my hope and my prayer. So thank you all for coming tonight. One more question. Yes, Russell. Exact same presentation. Exact same presentation. Maybe different questions depending on who's there, but exact same presentation. I just wanted an option for folks that might not feel comfortable getting out at nighttime or have more free time during the day to come out and make one of the presentations. And we're keeping it up online as well so people can watch online. But it's going to be the exact same presentation. It's going to be live streamed as well. But I really do appreciate y'all coming out. And I know sometimes you get those questions that you think about what you've heard and talked about and everything like that, and you get another question like, 8 hours later or 12 hours later. Give me a call. I'd be happy to answer any questions that might come up because I do my best thinking like after events happen. I don't know if y'all are the same way, but I do my best thinking. I never hardly ask questions when I'm in y'all's seats because I'm still processing information. So if you need time to process, please do not hesitate to reach out to me with questions. If I don't know it, I'll try and find the answer. If I know it, I will share the factual information with you to the best of my abilities, all right? So let's pray. Lord Jesus Christ, when we face uncertain futures and we don't know where to turn and which way to go, Lord God, we pray that we can commit our futures into the palm of your hands. We are here today because we love this church and we love serving you and we want to be faithful to your service. And so we pray, Lord, that we can place this uncertain future in the palm of your hands, that we trust the light in the lamp of the Holy Spirit to lead us to new and amazing places. Help us, Lord, as we go from here to serve you in everything that we do and to commit ourselves to living in your grace in all things. We pray this through Christ our Lord. Amen.